Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth webinar in the Implementing Community-Based Violence Intervention Strategies webinar series. Throughout the webinar, helpful links will be available in the chat box. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box found at the base of your Zoom screen. The panelists will answer as many of your questions as time allows. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online and in a follow-up email afterwards. Captions are available and can be turned on or off using the menu at the base of your screen. Please join the discussion today on social media using hashtag CVI Strengthening Communities. Now, I am pleased to introduce to you our MC for our webinar series, Mr. Eddie Bocanegra, Senior Advisor in the Office of the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs.
Thank you, Kiana, and thank you for all those who are attending today's webinar. Well, last month, we highlighted the importance of trauma-responsive and CVI practices. Today's webinar will continue to build on the importance of collaboration, particularly by those who have been doing the research and efforts to help elevate the field. Our overall goals for these webinars continue to be centered around commitment to collaboration, building the ecosystem of community safety, and third, advancing best practices in building safer communities. Today, children under the age of 5 are in a much better position because of decades of years in advocacy and research. We know today that investing in early childhood development actually helps strengthen the positive outcomes of a young person. The same we know about our returning veterans who have participated in employment and who have been exposed to trauma. While there have been hundreds of research studies that look for effective ways to prevent and reduce violence, we're not even close to the degree that occur with early childhood development and veterans. And while there have been many studies on violence prevention, I would argue that not all research is reflective of the communities we are trying to support. I have today the honor to introduce a good friend and colleague who is leading our efforts at NIJ and who is already helping to shape this important issue by getting us to think outside the box and leverage the very best in the field. With that, I'd like to pass it on to our director, Nancy Levine from NIJ. Nancy?
Thank you, Eddie, and greetings all. I'd like to start by setting the stage a bit for the conversation that's to follow. We have a distinguished collection of panelists we're going to engage in, I think, a very lively and informative discussion. There will be time for Q&A at the end. But for now, I just want to do a little bit of a description of the basic principles that apply to the type of research we think is important and necessary to develop effective CVI programs, to implement them with fidelity, and to ensure that we're collecting the right information so that we can evaluate the outcomes and impacts of those efforts. So next slide, please. All of this is about measurement. Measurement is really integral to everything to do with CVI initiatives. As I was saying, it helps inform the development of programs, making sure those programs are tailored to the nature of the problem as it is being experienced at the community level by community members. It helps engage community members if it's done in an inclusive way, which I'll talk about soon. And it also helps inform ways that programs can be improved upon, expanded, and sustained over time. And importantly, and I know this comes in the title of this webinar, effective measurement can help with effective communication. Next slide. But first, let's back up a little bit and talk about research evidence and what it is and what we mean by it when we say research evidence. Now, like traditionally, a lot of people think about evidence as empirical evidence, which is evidence that can be quantified with hard numbers. Other people would argue that qualitative data is also evidence, and I would agree with that. Qualitative data is more about narratives, stories, experiences. When you look at research evidence, it can range from along a continuum of what many would argue as the most rigorous, which is like a randomized controlled trial that's essentially an experimental design like you might see in medical studies, to community-based participatory research that's grounded in the narratives and experiences of people. And what I would argue is that there's a lot along this continuum and that the best evidence combines these two, right? Now, evaluation findings are one type of research evidence. And in the context of CVI, they're an important type, right? Because we want to know whether the CVI programs work. Next slide. Evaluation is important because it can measure the quality of program implementation. It can help quantify success. It can identify areas in need of improvement, and it can make the case for continuation and expansion. Next slide. So let's talk about the components of the evaluation process. I've named 4 of them here. One could argue that there's many more, but the general categories are baseline data collection, ongoing measurement, performance measurement, impact evaluation, and then the communication of findings, which I would argue is an important component of an evaluation process. Next slide. So let's start with baseline data collection. I often talk about baseline data collection as answering the W questions. Who, what, when, where, why, right? Maybe you added an H question, the how. This is about problem solving at the local level. And in the context of CVI, it's about measuring where is the violence problem happening. And we know that a lot of people use community very loosely. Sometimes people describe communities as entire jurisdictions. We know that violence doesn't occur equally across entire jurisdictions. It needs to be informed. We need to understand, using data and conversations, who's experiencing the violence and where. And we know that happens at a pretty micro level, right? But we also know with CVI programs that they need to be focused on the people who are at highest risk of being involved in violence. So how do we find that out? Well, again, data is useful. It could be quantitative data. It could be qualitative data. So you could be extracting data from the local police department, but you could also be having conversations with people in the community about what they know about networks and who's involved in them. So the importance here about baseline data collection is that it needs to happen to inform program development in a way that can guide the development of tailored programs, right? Because we can learn a lot from examples of what works in CVI programs in different jurisdictions, but we all know that violence is unique to local issues and contexts, right? So you can't just take a cookie cutter approach. You need to do that baseline data collection to understand the nature and context and contours of your own specific community violence issues that you're aspiring to address. So that's one important reason for baseline data collection. But the other important reason is that the same data that you collect to help inform developing your program is the data that serves as a point of comparison from which to evaluate the program after it's been implemented. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is, now we get into the meat of it, which is measurement, measurement, measurement. It's really important to do this early and often. We talked about the measurements necessary to develop a program that's tailored to the community issues and needs. But then you're developing that program, right? And how do you do that? Where do you start? The best way to start is through the development of what's known as a logic model. Now that might sound like a fancy term, but all it is really kind of connecting the dots between the outcomes you want to achieve and how you think you're going to get there. So one example would be if your CVI program aspires to increase service delivery to people who are at risk of being involved in violence, okay? So that's your end goal. Or actually, your end goal is that increasing service delivery to those individuals will reduce community violence, right? But then you work upstream and you say, well, what are the things that we need to do to increase that service delivery? Well, that includes identifying the people who are at highest risk. It means identifying their needs. It means identifying the services in the community that can meet their needs. It means referring them to those services. It means tracking whether they're actually taking up those services and taking advantage of them. And then, of course, tracking whether ultimately that's leading to the end goal of reducing violence. Those logic models are not just academic exercises. They're what help understand what to be measuring along the way, and they also keep everyone focused on a shared vision for the action, for what needs to happen. That kind of performance metrics assessment is essential to understanding and improving what we call implementation fidelity. What is implementation fidelity? It's doing what you said you were going to do, or measuring whether you did what you said you were going to do. So the example I just gave is a good one for this as well. If you find along the way that you have done a good job of identifying people who are at high risk, identifying what their needs are, identifying the services that are available in the community, but you find through ongoing performance measurement that those referrals aren't happening for some reason or another, that's a huge disconnect in your logic. If you can identify that through ongoing performance measurement, you can fix it. So performance metrics are important for both those shorter term and intermediate outcomes, as well as for the longer term outcomes, like reduction in violence in the community. Now, another component of this type of measurement is the feedback loop. This is often termed action research, and it's when your research partners are not only collecting all of this information over time, but sharing it back with the program stakeholders so that they can make changes along the way. This is not your typical ivory tower at arm's length type of evaluation work that many academics were trained to do. Back in the day, it was frowned upon for researchers to share findings back. What they do is say, yeah, I'll be your evaluation partner. I'll collect the data and I'll let you know after the fact whether your program worked. That is not the evaluation of today. That's not the evaluation that NIJ wants to see or that OJP wants to promote for CVI. What we want to see is true partnerships with researchers and program stakeholders where those findings are continually shared back so that we can continually improve those programs and increase the odds that they're going to yield their intended impact. Next slide. So how do you do that? How do you find those researchers? There's a lot of researchers out there, and trust me, they're all interested in partnering with you. They're interested because they are interested in issues of violence reduction, sincerely. They're interested because they're looking for data sources so that they can publish largely in academic journals designed for academic audiences. And some are interested because they really want to authentically engage in partnership with community members. So there's a lot of different types of researchers out there, and the challenge is to find those that are really going to help develop and implement and evaluate programs in a way that you need them to. So the best research partners are those who embrace what I'm terming inclusive research principles. Now, inclusive research is this concept of no matter what the methodology, it is important that the researchers take time to hear from the people closest to the issue or problem at hand. Now, I was describing earlier the continuum of types of research. Some can be highly quantitative, others can be very qualitative and narrative-based, and there's a lot in between. In the context of inclusive research, the most extreme end of the continuum is community-based participatory research. And one way I like to describe this type of research is, I don't know if you've ever heard that saying about diversity and inclusion, but that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Well, community-based participatory research turns even that concept on its head. With CPDR, it's the community that's doing the inviting. It's the community that's deciding what food will be on the menu. It's really, truly community-led in partnership with research. Now that's aspirational, it takes hard work and it takes a lot of time. And some of our panelists can share more about that model. But even if you're taking a more traditional evaluation approach, you can still be inclusive and really should be. So those are the types of researchers you want to seek. People who embrace inclusive research processes, people who also embrace that action research partnership where they're fielding back information, feeding it back to the program stakeholders so that they can make improvements along the way. And also approach their work with what I call a racial equity lens, like recognizing and understanding where issues of racial disparity and disparities of all kinds exist, both in interactions, say with criminal justice stakeholders and community members, in the data sources. For example, if the only data you're using is arrest, you need to stop and think, is that the most valid data source, or should I complement it because a manner of arrest happened based on where people live and, frankly, the color of their skin. So you want researchers that have that lens and bring that approach to their work. And finally, you want a researcher that's humble and open to really not just hearing about and documenting, but learning from community perspectives. And, I'm a researcher, so I can speak for the field. A lot of researchers, we think we're the experts. And I would say we are the experts on the methodology, but we're not the expert on the problem. The experts on the problems are the people who are experiencing them. So those are the types of researchers you want to seek if you're leading a program or working on a program in some way. But there's also really the best programmatic partners, and they have a big role to play in ensuring that this measurement and communication happens well too. They are people who make the program staff and the participants and the data available to the research partners, because that's a necessary precondition to doing the work. They have to be open to both positive and constructive feedback. A lot of people who develop and implement programs, they're pretty wedded to them. They believe in them. They think they work, and they probably do. But you have to be open to room for improvement. And the best programmatic partners are really curious. They're inquisitive, and they don't challenge researchers per se, but they ask good questions about the data findings in ways that helps really build a better and more authentic understanding of what we're learning along the way. And for both the research partners and the programmatic partners, both require trust building. And perhaps we'll get into this during the discussion period, but we at NIJ are keenly aware of the long history of research conducted on communities rather than with communities. We know that's a pain point. We know that there's a lack of trust. We know that some communities have been over-researched, over-surveyed, and never see the results of the findings. So that trust building really needs to happen as a precondition. Next slide. And finally, communicating your findings, right? How does data inform how you communicate your findings? Well, I would argue, and these aren't hard and fast rules, but that it's helpful to target your message and the data you present to people based on the audience you're presenting to. So for your programmatic partners, it's really important to emphasize what you're learning about implementation fidelity, right? Because then they can be partners in making improvements along the way and increasing the odds that the program is yielding its intended violence reduction impact. But if you're presenting to community members and other community stakeholders, you might want to do something quite different, like holding a data walk. data walks are really cool. I've been a part of them in the past. They recognize that not everybody learns about information in the same way. So rather than just sharing a report or tables with data or graphs, they visualize the findings in a lot of different ways and then put them up on walls and have people walk around and engage with the research partners that can help kind of translate what those findings are and engage with residents and stakeholders on how they're interpreting that information and how it resonates with them and their experiences, and importantly, engaging them in conversations about how this information has implications for making changes in policies and practices. And then finally, funders and public officials tend to be more traditional, and I think featuring more empirical data, more numbers, is more likely to speak to those audiences. But I would argue that for all audiences, the best way is to combine numbers and narratives. That's really the most persuasive way to share findings. And I would say this too, perceptions matter as much as hard numbers. I mean, you could measure documented firearms fatalities or injuries as going down, but if you're not also hearing from community members, or you find that the community members still feel unsafe, that's valid too. You still need that information. And of course, when you're sharing your findings, I think it's important not to just focus on the positives. There's so much we can learn from areas in need of improvement, including learning from failure. That's a part of life. Next slide, please. So I just want to wrap up to share that NIJ will be releasing in the new year some requests for proposals that can help support evaluation of CVI projects. There's a few different categories. This is public information. There'll be requests for proposals to evaluate CVI projects. There'll be opportunities to serve as a training and technical assistance entity to support CVI evaluation efforts, as well as citywide violent problem analysis efforts. And there will also be an opportunity to submit proposals for complementary research as it pertains to issues related to community violence and violence prevention. Next slide, please. So with that, I am going to stop talking and welcome our panelists to unmute themselves and show their videos and introduce themselves. We have Eddie, who you've met already. We've got Dr. Shawnee Buggs, Dr. Philip Graham, Dr. Henrika McCoy, and Dr. Yasser Arafat Payne. I would like to perhaps cease sharing the slideshow so that the audience can see all these wonderful faces and amazing experts. And I want to invite each of you to share a little bit about who you are as it pertains to the conversation that we're about to have, which is to say research, evaluation, and measurement that's inclusive of community perspectives and that supports violence reduction activities. So Eddie, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Nancy. So I'll keep my remarks very short here. So I am a senior advisor under the Office of Justice Programs with OAG. And so my role here is to help inform and advise our leadership here with the work around CVI. And as you can imagine, CVI has so many intersections, whether it's criminal justice, trauma, and so on. So it's a really amazing opportunity to be in this role. I will just say, for the sake of our introductions and to add some legitimacy to my perspective here, that I have almost 15 years of experience of implementation, working in the streets as an interrupter, as an outreach worker, working for some of the largest organizations who today across the country and across the world, those models are continuing to be implemented. I would also say that I've had the distinct pleasure of working with several researchers, from Desmond Patton at the University of Columbia, who's now at Penn State, doing social media, with also recently with the Crime Lab, where we had a randomized controlled trial study, which I hope I get a chance to speak a little bit more about. but all of it centered around this particular population. And again, this what you raised about implementation. Oh my goodness, there's so much that I want to say about that. And the last thing that I'll just simply point out is, while there's a unique perspective that I bring into this, I would have to say and argue that research does help inform our strategies on the ground. It helps inform policies that we want to recommend, even at the federal level. And I would also say that it is an opportunity for us to really elevate this field in a way that so many other disciplines, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, early childhood development and veterans, there's so much that we could borrow from the way they went about to elevating their work, their research, to make a stronger arguments for those vulnerable populations. So with that note, I will pass it on. I'm just going to pass it on here to Dr. Bugs, if you don't mind.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Shawnee Bugs with the University of California Davis Violence Prevention Research Program. I have been studying community violence intervention and prevention for about a decade now. And I come into this work from Baltimore. I am a public health and public policy trained researcher and studied at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And while I was in Baltimore, I also worked for the Baltimore Mayor's Office, helping to coordinate the city's violent crime reduction strategies. And it was there that I really recognized the disconnect between a lot of the research on community violence and intervention and prevention, and the realities of practicing community violence intervention and prevention, particularly at the local level. So I focused my research from then on primarily to think about how to elevate and center the experiences of those who are most impacted by violence in the research. I think, as Nancy said beautifully, the experts of the problem are those experiencing the problem. And so how do we, as the research community, really embrace that idea? Because I think that has not always been the case across various sectors, but particularly as it relates to community violence, interpersonal violence. And so while I've studied state firearm policy and thinking about how laws focus on prohibiting individuals from accessing firearms, the bulk of my work has been around community violence intervention and prevention. And so I have done work focused on implementation and operational challenges related to outreach-based violence intervention programs or initiatives. I actually recently just published a report funded by LISC that highlights so many of the knowledge and expertise of violence intervention leaders around the country, as well as a study focused in Kansas City, thinking about the community violence prevention infrastructure there and how that work supports addressing trauma, not just trauma of outreach workers and frontline violence intervention professionals, but also the broader trauma experienced by the community when you have chronic exposure to violence, as individuals in Kansas City, Missouri, as well as individuals around the country have. So I'm really honored to be among this panel and looking forward to the discussion. And I will pass it.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Yes, pass it along.
I'll pass it on to Dr. Graham.
Good afternoon, and depending on where you are, maybe good morning to others. To say I'm excited and honored to be here would be an understatement. I tweeted out earlier, I'm actually here to do more learning probably than teaching, just because of this distinguished panel. Again, my name is Philip Graham. I currently work at RTI International. And I'm a little nervous here about talking about how long I've been doing this work. I think Dr. Bug said the last 10 years. I'm approaching on 30, but I started when I was 12. So if you're concerned about the look, that's why. But I started this work by accident when I moved to Sacramento, California in 1992, thinking I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, and started doing community-based work and stumbled into really helping communities solve problems. As you probably remember, that was at the height of Black on Black crime and trying to figure out what was going on and how you support communities. And through that investigation and some of the early demonstration projects, I stumbled into this thing called public health. I had no idea what it was. But I also would go back to DC and folks would be on the dais who didn't look like me talking about how to solve the problems of communities. And fortunately, I'm married to an incredible African-American female who said, if you're going to do something about it, do something about it and stop complaining. And that's why I ended up coming back to North Carolina doing my doctoral work at the School of Public Health for the primary reason to have a seat at the table, to be able to bring a different perspective to how we think about these problems with respect to violence in general, but violence specifically among Black males. And so my dissertation work was really focusing on what is the impact of just witnessing violence in community on the lives in terms of trauma and subsequent violence perpetration. So that's how my work began. And so for the last almost 30 years, I've worked in the space of trying to understand what are the best interventions with respect through a cultural lens for boys and men of color and community and marginalized communities in general. And so I've had the fortunate to lead a team of researchers here at RTI, really understanding how do we bring advanced methods to doing work in community. And while I completely agree that RCT is a gold standard, it is always not the gold standard in terms of understanding how to research community. And so instead of saying, well, it doesn't work, what we've tried to do is really, how do we use advanced methods and really doing what I call messy real world science? Because at the end of the day, what we do in efficacy trials in terms of controlling everything is important, beginning understanding what works and what doesn't. But once you take the training wheels off, that's the real and most important piece of how we do this work. And so that's what I've tried to bring to this violence prevention space. What I'll try to talk about today is a current project that I have in Milwaukee that's really testing this question. They've been doing some incredible work around community trauma and developing a blueprint around activities that really address community violence, including interrupters, violence interrupters, one of the components. I'm interested in what was the role of community organizing. So what we've done is combine a couple of these things I'll talk about in our Q&A around how you use methods. So the first was, how do you do community research and using some aspects of randomization by using what we call N-of-1 studies. And so often in much of our research is that we want to do community level interventions, but when they get reviewed, someone says, well, you don't have a large enough sample size. And so I'll talk about things like N-of-1 studies or what's called idiographic centered trials, where you really compare a neighborhood against itself. That's the first example. The second example is really understanding the importance of context, and context matters. And this is why I say that it's not qualitative data or quantitative data, it's both. And anyone who pits one against the other, I would question you working with them, because it takes both. If you're just looking at outcomes and have no idea what was implemented, we really can't talk about what works and what doesn't work. And so as a part of that, Nancy talked about implementation fidelity. Hopefully I'll get a chance today to talk about implementation science, which is not the same. And so implementation science is really about, once we prove that something works, is really about what are the most effective strategies to the delivery of those evidence-based strategies. And that really makes the way we go about doing that is really understanding context. And so I'll close by saying, as an example, often the federal government funds demonstration projects, and that's based on some community figured out how to solve a problem, and everyone wants to replicate it. No one asked the question, though, how many times did you fail before you succeeded? And that's a part of important data collection, because you can take something off the shelf or something that's worked in one neighborhood and it completely failed. And not because of the intervention, but because you didn't spend the time to understand the importance of context. And so really, I tried to develop my career over the last 2+ decades to understand how you bring those methods to do work in communities. And so again, I don't know how I got invited here, but I'm beyond excited to hear this conversation today and hope I can contribute to really understanding how we think about data and use it in ways that is both empowering to communities and really allow them to feed that back into the success of what we want to promote. So I'll stop there. I could talk for the rest of the day. I had a long list of things I wanted to share. Nancy gave me 3 minutes and I think I've exceeded that. So I'm going to stop. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks. We'll turn it over to Dr. Henrica McCoy.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Henrika McCoy. I'm at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin. And I come to this work really from, I feel old listening to now Dr. Bugs and Dr. Graham. From being a social worker, a clinical social worker, I was a direct service provider about 30 years ago for quite some time, and really came to this work after having clients in front of me that were often exposed to the juvenile legal system, but really as a social worker having not a very clear understanding of how to help my clients navigate that system. And so saw lots of questions, and I was a young Black social worker, one of only 2 Blacks where I worked and one of a few in kind of the whole environment, and recognizing that my clients really to me were being misunderstood. So where they would see optional defiant disorder or they would see conduct disorder, I saw major depression. I saw something else going on that to me, really, there was a context that was being missed because of a lack of real kind of cultural understanding. And so all those questions eventually led me to decide to, leave direct service, go back to school, get a PhD, and really focus a lot of my early work and still, I think, really continue in my heart, kind of my passion about how mental health issues really precipitate the involvement of young Black men into the justice system, and how those legal issues really impact them going forward. And the extension of that, of course, is they grow up, and we know that many of those young men and young women as well, but young men tend to be where I focus my work, that they have had exposure to violence. And so taking advantage of the opportunity a number of years ago to apply for an NIJ grant and be fortunate to receive it, that focused on emerging adults 18 to 24, young Black men who had experienced violence. And so coming at this work from that perspective of understanding that that population are the most impacted by violence, but where we have the least amount of research. And that so often we think about violence, we think about community violence, which is important, but we fail to think about all the other things that go into that. And so our study, which is technically kind of still ongoing, we have lots of untapped data that we will hopefully get to, but it was a national study thinking about how to create an instrument so that could be used in research and practice to understand those experiences and understanding that violence goes on top of violence. So for many young Black men that are in communities, they experience violence in the military, in school, hate crimes, familial abuse, all these things go together. And so when they experience community violence, this is not often the first thing, it is one of many. So really wanting to understand what those experiences were, what were the resources they were able to tap into, what kind of access and supports did they have, and what did they not have, and what did they need, so that we could better understand, even within kind of community violence, what we were getting. One of the things that often stuck out when we were doing that study was to remind people that so many young Black men go to the military, and they often go to the military from areas where they experience community violence. And that we assume that for them, they're going to the system and they come back like many other young men, but they went into it often with a traumatized experience that we then re-traumatize them, and how that plays out and how that continues that cycle. Or for in those families where they experience familial abuse or sexual abuse or other types of abuse, and then they experience community violence, what does that mean? That we can't just kind of look at it from one perspective. So thinking about community violence as part of a larger system of violence and understanding from their perspective, what does that mean? What does that look like? How people understand that? How is it responded to? And what are the kind of myriad of services that we need? And what is the dynamic process that happens when they are being re-traumatized, not only by the community, but by the system that's supposed to provide services and access. So my work really is thinking about that and understanding that we have young Black men that start very early on experiencing violence in schools and their communities, but they grow up and continue to experience that violence. And so wanting to have a better understanding of that so that people who do the great work like those on this call can have even a more broader understanding of what we're talking about when we think about community violence, so that we have a really broad understanding of where should we be narrow, where should we be large, and what should the context be when we think about appropriate intervention and prevention strategies so that we can create a really healthy atmosphere for this population that is really most impacted. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Dr. Payne. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you this morning and this afternoon. Again, my name is Yasser Payne. I'm on faculty in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. I have a PhD in social personality psychology, but I am I would call mixed methods street ethnographer. We collect large samples of, we collect large community survey samples as well as large qualitative samples as well. Actually come to this work, I guess, from, personally and professionally. I do come from one of those families, so to speak. in Harlem, New York City. I do also have my set of experiences with regards to the streets and all of that good stuff. I come to the experience though professionally, particularly as a social worker, doing a lot of street outreach work in places like New York City or places like Paterson, New Jersey, or the South Side of Chicago. And eventually I would, stumble upon a PhD program where I could actually train in participatory action research. And it was the most amazing experience that I had, particularly, in my research career. I actually thought all doctoral students and/or researchers, could do PAR, or they were exposed to that kind of opportunity, and I didn't realize how limited that experience was, particularly then. And this is like 15 to 18 years ago when I started my PhD program. In any event, I engage in something called street participatory action research, something that we coined or created. It's the way that I do street ethnography, right? And in short, street PAR is about including on or in the research process members of the streets, or persons that may be involved in gang violence or drug dealing, or, so to speak, and involve them in every phase of the research process: development of theory, methods, analysis, right? Co-authorships, take them to academic conferences, right? And pay them for that experience, right? I often say street PAR is about bringing the doctoral student experience down to the street corner, right? And we do not compromise the methods training. The methods training is rigorous. It is hard. Why? Well, because I need to transition them into high quality employment and educational opportunity. And we have lots of experiences doing that. So street PAR is also a 2-level intervention, right? It's about equipping the streets with a reading, writing, data analysis, formal speaking, and organizing skill set, right, to get out of the streets, right? And in addition to that, it's also about working with those guys and women to organize or participate in local programming from the perspective of the community. So in addition to doing formal organizing, like presenting our work to city council or the governor's office, right? Sometimes the community says, you know what, we need to do a mixtape project on gun violence, and then host or organize a musical showcase. And, we have, experiences doing well-attended street art exhibitions on gun violence, inequality, et cetera, right? And, like Nancy said, this is hard work, right? If you're taking it seriously, right? But it's all worth it. It's all worth it and very refreshing to the spirit. So I'll end there, but that's the work that I do.
Thank you so much. And I think we agreed in a prior convening that we're okay using our first names. So if you'll allow me, this is such an amazing collection of people. I'm just thrilled to be hearing from you and learning from you. I think what I'd like to do is start with Eddie, because Eddie, I've heard you say this a lot when it comes to measurement. Your concerns about our ability to identify who is at highest risk so that you can target your programs to those individuals. Where does research and measurement come into play in identifying those individuals?
Yeah, Nancy, this particular question that you're lifting up is one that I struggle quite a bit. When I think about the folks that are applying for our resources, right? Or when I visit different cities and I look at, what's under the hood of the car, so to speak, right? What does the service look like? What does their engagement look like? And one of the valuable lessons that I took away from Ready Chicago, and this is why it's important to partner with institutions and to cultivate those relationships, because, as someone who's done direct service on the ground, street intervention work, outreach, I always wondered, how is it that there are a specific population that we're not necessarily always in relationship or in contact with? Meaning that the power of an outreach worker really relies on that person's social networks. And if we're hiring people with lived experience, people who've been formerly incarcerated, which I'm glad we're doing that, because this is like one of the very few entry positions, right, work for this population. Too often, what happens is that, they are getting older, right? As Philip pointed out, like people get older and you kind of lose some level of credibility. You're also the younger generation, right? Social media So all these different things are changing. And with that change comes the ability or not of being able to engage what I would consider high-risk individuals. In my experience, as I've seen in many cities, not in all cases, but a large percentage of those that are in our case that outreach workers might have in their caseloads, I could argue now because of the RCT study that not all of them fit the definition that I would say are classified as high risk. Meaning that just because you live in the west side of Chicago, in the south side, or the west side of Baltimore, it doesn't mean that you're a high risk individual. Yes, you're in a community that is highly at risk in terms of like, needs and services and so on, right? And the probability of you living there compared to somewhere else who lives more affluent community, right, tend to be higher. But even within that peer group, there are certain people that are still at a higher risk than others. And that particular group tends to account, based on research, about 70–80% of the victimization and violence here. And so one of the things that I learned through this process was not every organization is really reaching out to those who are at the highest risk. And so to answer your question here is, it's important that we leverage data to think about another way to create checks and balances. How do we use hospital data? How do we use police data? How do we use other data points to really help us in our strategy of who's missing out? Because most people who are driving to violence are what I would consider non-social service seekers, meaning they're not coming to our door looking for services, right? They're not in after-school programs. They're not, in fact, engaged in school programs. So this is what I mean by, are we really targeting the right people to provide wraparound services?
That's a fantastic point, and one I've observed in my own research. I'm curious to know maybe we'll turn it over to Yasser first, because I saw you nodding around Eddie's point around networks. If you can share a little bit more about how you've learned about networks through Streetpar that could help better identify people who are really in need of the intervention.
Yeah, I often, as has been noted in a number of different ways already, the top, experts, at least for me inside communities, are often, the folk that I'm working with, guys that may be formerly involved or currently involved in the streets. They oftentimes will identify for me, particularly the formal networks or the formal partners. The way I organize my Streetpar projects, right, there are three parts. They're the formal researchers, students, and faculty or formal scholars. You have Streetpar associates, right? But we also have institutional partnership. And before I start any Streetpar project, I'm working usually with one or two associates who we call senior research associates. And they will identify for me the folk to work with. Sometimes they used to enter communities or I'll work with a nonprofit or want to work with a nonprofit, and because they have the name or the office right, and they'll let me know, no, that's not the group you want to work with, or they don't really want us in there, or a lot of the work they do with us inside these neighborhoods is actually performative or rhetorical, or the kind of ground level reach that you want, won't be reciprocated, and right, so they oftentimes identify for me who are the right particular institutional or formal partners or the right formal network to engage with. The other thing I want to say with this is this term or concept of risk, right? It's a highly relative concept or this kind of language that we drum up, right? Could be very problematic inside neighborhoods. Victor Rios, who's a street ethnographer, University of California, he often talks about, or he reframes at risk, in terms of at promise. And there are a number of folk that are saying that. We also argue, have a theory called sites of resilience, or that crime or a street identity, and dare I say, gun violence is a site of resilience. We don't mean that it's a good thing. I never met any guy in the streets that thought gun violence was good. I never met anybody who sold drugs who thought selling drugs was good, right? So we have to get much more complicated in our analysis. But due to the extreme structural violence that they are experiencing, right, whole neighborhoods, right, immersed in all kinds of structural disadvantage for decades on end, right? Marginalized populations, which are actually few and far between. Keep in mind, 1 to 2% of any city is responsible for all its violence. 1%, less than 1% of Black America is responsible for all the crime in Black America, right? Folk are most likely to die from drug overdoses as opposed to gun homicides. And even with gun violence and people dying from it, they're more likely to die from suicide, right? But nonetheless, it is a problem. One death, one homicide is one too many. And or the larger point I'm trying to make is that marginalized persons and groups or populations come up with clever or nifty or adaptive strategies to survive. And this is what this is all about.
Yeah.
We don't know anything that works better to reduce violence than stable opportunity. Everything else comes a distant second. That's why with my street part intervention, we pay people to learn, like we do the doctoral students, right? Have a national study in 4 cities. We pay everybody $25 an hour for 20 to 30 hours a week, right? So, nonetheless, that's the way that I think about networks, and also that's the way that I think about this.
Thank you for that. You touched upon a theme that almost everyone else did. I think actually everyone else did, and that's the role that trauma plays in community violence, but also in interventions, right? Because you have outreach workers who are exposed to violence, sometimes vicariously, sometimes even firsthand through the nature of their work. So I'm curious to hear from other panelists. Perhaps, Henrico, we'll start with you on your learnings and observations around trauma as it pertains to community violence and efforts to reduce it.
Well, I think what's important to remember is that more than likely, everyone who lives in an area that is exposed to community violence is traumatized. You don't have to be the person who is witnessing something to be traumatized. The fact is, it impacts how you live, the choices that you make, what you do, and where you go. I currently live in Austin, but I just moved from Chicago. I'm a native of Chicago, and I love Chicago, and I don't want to say anybody bad about Chicago. I've lived in other places. I'm a Chicago deep in my heart, but the fact is I have lived in a Black community my entire life when I lived in Chicago, and I am traumatized. I have been fortunate. I've not witnessed anyone killed. I've not had that experience. I've known many people who've experienced homicide in their family, both personally and professionally. But the fact is, where I live, I am traumatized about thinking about when I leave, where I go, what I do. Will the police stop me? Will someone accidentally think I'm someone who I didn't do something? Will they accidentally kick in my door, which is the police have tried to do, and I didn't do anything. So we forget that trauma is not only an individual experience, but a community experience. And so, of course, when we think about the workers who are brave to go and do this work because they are committed, they love, they care, they are taking with them their own experiences of trauma. And then we are asking them and expecting them to be re-traumatized in their efforts to try to affect change. So it is so important that we understand that trauma is repetitive, it re-victimizes. And so it has to be a community effort to think about who we're asking, what they're doing, how we respond not only to those who are being quote unquote helped, but those who are doing the quote unquote helping. And those who are really even on the sidelines, because they too are exposed to all of that, and it is one community working together.
So let me just tease that out a little bit more. So from a research perspective, are you suggesting that part of any evaluation needs to include measurements of the people who are engaged in the outreach to learn from them how they're experiencing the program? Have you seen that done in a systematic way, or is that something?
Yes, absolutely. I think Shani will be also a perfect person to talk about this, but I think absolutely, where research I think traditionally has failed is that we so often focus on the people who we think are being impacted because they're the obvious quote unquote victims, but we forget about everyone else. And only if we do engage in understanding their experiences can we get a total experience of understanding that. And so it is not just the one person, but it is measuring both qualitatively and quantitatively. I so heartily agree with everyone that numbers are great, but stories are what reaches into people's hearts. And so you have to be able to do both. And ideally, if you can get both from the same set of people, that's beyond amazing. Sometimes I think researchers don't even try that. Sometimes researchers will have very separate studies where they do the quantitative and go get someone else with the qualitative. That's fine. That's better than not. But we assume that people who engage in our kind of numbers-oriented research don't want to tell their story. And my experience has certainly been that people are dying for someone to ask. No one just bothers.
Yeah.
So our measures have
Yeah.
to include voices of the same people from different aspects and perspectives.
Sure, you build in those open-ended questions, right?
Absolutely.
Shawnee, let's kick it to you.
Yeah,
Pick up
so
where Henrika left off.
yeah, she gave me a softball. You know, Nancy, you asked about systematic research that is addressing this need to understand more about the trauma experienced by frontline workers. And there is research happening at Northwestern. Shout out to Dr. Catherine Bocanegra, who is at University of Illinois, Chicago, the better half of one of our esteemed panelists. And she and I also engaged in a research project, the project that I mentioned in Kansas City, that was truly around understanding what the infrastructure was for understanding trauma of frontline workers, and then what is being done to address it. And so in terms of research, there have been systematic surveys. We engaged in semi-structured interviews and focus groups to understand this. And I think one point, I love what Henrika said about, well, I love everything that she said, but particularly as related to understanding, you know, the various forms of trauma experienced by frontline workers. One area that I think has not been understood enough is the trauma that the workers can experience from their own organizations, from the political supporters or champions, you know, in city hall or in local government, who may believe in a program, but also may have a tendency to see the frontline interventionists as replaceable or as disposable. It is well known, I know across these panelists, how severely underfunded and undersupported the workforce has been. And many of the leaders of programs may understand that and fight for greater resources, but miss the impact of that on what it's like to carry that work into the workforce, and or that stress, that frustration about, you know, not having the stability that Yasser talked about. And when you were trying to save lives and help bring stability to others, but you yourself don't have that stability. And there are workers in my research, the list funded project that I talked about, that looked at implementation operational challenges of outreach-based violence intervention programs. Some of the experts talked about hearing others, you know, presumed supporters of the work saying, well, you know, they're doing this work because, you know, they're giving back to the community, or like it's a given, given the, you know, possible harm that some of the professionals may have committed in the past. You know, it's sort of like, this is charity work. And so therefore they don't deserve to be paid. They don't deserve, you know, or that's at least implied in some of the language. And it has been implied in the way that salary and benefits have largely been missing. You know, if you think about on the law enforcement side, there has been multi-millions, dare I say billions, spent thinking about worker wellness, recognizing the trauma that is experienced by police, and, you know, when they are engaging around violence or engaging in communities where there has been, you know, layers upon layers of structural violence placed on those communities. And so the lack of parallel support of community violence intervention workers is really dire. And I think, as I said, the missing piece of really understanding how the institutions and the organizations themselves that employ the workers may also be helping to perpetuate some of the trauma, or not, by either not addressing and not recognizing the trauma that is experienced, or by, you know, in a number of different ways, seeing the population as somewhat disposable and not fully deserving of all of the benefits, all of the recognition, time off, staffing so that people have the ability to step away when the work and stress gets to be too much, recognizing that, when violence occurs in communities, many of the violence interventionists know individuals on both sides of the weapon, right? And the complication that comes with that, as do many people in the communities. And so, thinking about how all of these pieces really need to be better understood, I think that's where, research has a huge role to play, and those studies are happening, but I think we're just now beginning to really uncover how very much these workers endure.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. That you clearly really illustrated the nature and depth of the problem so well. And, I think about it as, bringing humanity to this work, number one, but also, like, you're not going to be successful or sustain these programs if you're not taking care of the people who are on the front line, right? As you said, it's like any other profession, and it has to be treated that way. Philip, I'm interested if you have anything to add, either to that specific topic or the topic of trauma more generally that you'd like to share. Oh, you're on mute. It had to be someone.
At some point in time, I knew I was going to fail miserably. I apologize. I think the issue of trauma is important to understand, but I think my other colleagues have really spoke to this issue of community trauma, right? And it's not the aggregate of individual trauma, but there's something much more pervasive based on a history of kind of these, structural inequalities that really, and sometimes really are the reason why solutions can't be effective, right? And so if you're experiencing trauma, you are less likely to engage in some of the things that might bring about solutions. And so this is where we begin to talk about trauma and healing, right? And that becoming an important part of the intervention side. What from the research side, what I want to understand is, and how do we effectively measure that, right? And so for a long time, we now using the term community level interventions. And I think that's where the field needs to go. And as important as individual interventions are, they're a band-aid to the problem. And so, and I want to say this in the right way, and hopefully I don't get in trouble. Like the work that interrupters do is needed because it's about the day-to-day, saving lives in the midst of chaos and stress, right? But that's not the long game. And the long game is, how do we move upstream to figure out how we prevent having to need interrupters to deal with those things that, again, are a response to survival. And so from a research perspective, what I'm interested in is, how do we codify what that looks like when we talk about community level evaluations of these community level interventions. And one of the things that in a project in Milwaukee, I talk about documenting community touch. And what do I mean by that? Like, every time you do something in a targeted area, then how do you document that? And not even about the what, just the thing that happened, right? If you walk the streets speaking to people, that's a community touch. And it's a simple thing of community touch important about changing perspectives of safety and wellness, right? And so that's not a traditional way of thinking about it, because again, we want to talk about what the specific thing was, which is important, but at the same time, just looking at that volume of capacity, what I call, measures of well-being. And that if you are not showing up to a community to engage them in a way that's positive, then it's something negative. And so that's from a measurement standpoint. We're trying to figure out how to document in Milwaukee everything the Office of Violence Prevention does in neighborhoods with them or by residents. How do you, that's one point that says that, if you're looking at the impact of change over time, neighborhood X had 150 touches of something versus neighborhood Y had 10. Does that differential help explain some of the stuff we're seeing? And so just getting creative about, measurement. The second part of that goes back to trauma, and that this is about systems. And, we haven't really talked even right now about how do we measure systems change as a part of dealing with these larger structural issues? Because again, we need to tackle interventions need to tackle individuals, But if we aren't simultaneously looking at systems efforts, then the data we get will be important. One other thing I talk about is something can be statistically significant, but it's not clinically or meaningful. Meaning that, and what I mean by that is, if you look, you'll say nothing much has changed, right? And so the individual data says something's working, but at that large scale, we don't see anything in the outside world says this thing isn't working, right? And so how do we look for meaningful change as well as statistical change? So
Right.
I'll stop there, and so because Yasser has his hand raised, so that's
very good.
what I've heard and kind of interjecting there. So I'll stop there. So and much rather hear others kind of talk. So Yasser.
Thank you.
Cool. And I'll be brief. Just really quickly with regard to trauma and healing, which is so important when doing this work. I'm so happy that we're talking about this. One of the ways that we deal with, and I recommend, suggest, and there are a number of folk that are doing it to kind of handle issues or experiences with trauma, particularly as it relates to frontline staff, or in my case, Street Par associates. When the funding is afforded, we bring in case management teams, right? That can demonstrate or execute culturally relevant forms, right, of case management. And that's very important, right? And we do case management at the individual level, as well as at the group or team level, right? In addition to that, we work with, or have worked with, therapists. Right? So therapy, I'm a big fan of that. I'm a psychologist anyway, right? But culturally relevant forms of therapy. And in my experience, and we do argue and publish, right? Many of the guys that are involved with the streets, all right, are not resistant to therapy. First of all, they'll talk your ear off if they trust you. They'll really pour into you, right? What's going on is therapists and case managers are not trained to engage them in a culturally relevant way around trauma. I think healing, right, should also be a focus. I love this discussion. It should be an empirical focus. We need to examine what healing looks like from their perspective. Sean Ginwright does some excellent work on Black youth and healing. Also, Dr. Andrew Corey Green with his Street Par program in Brooklyn, New York, called HALA, How Our Lives Link All Together, right? Their research program is, and that's an all blood set too. That's an all blood set, which is interesting. Dr. Andrew Corey Green was also part of the documentary 13, right? But their entire research program in Brooklyn is based on healing. So that's all.
Eddie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very powerful part of the conversation here, and one that I think that grossly gets overlooked. So I want to point out a couple of things just building up what's already been said, particularly from Henrica and Shawnee. Again, the world of outreach interrupters, like that's where I come from. I was in a documentary called The Interrupters, and it really created more of an awareness, right, of what outreach workers and interrupters are actually doing on the ground. And for some people, right, for some members in the audience, right, it's really romanticized. And sometimes even for students who are in grad school, I remember when I was at U Chicago, many of them were like, "Hey Eddie, how do I get involved?" And you could tell right away, like, are these people who are just like want to put in their resume, or these are people who are very serious about really making a change in this, right? And that's really important because I want to highlight a couple of things. The first is that the field of gun violence, there are particularly three models I just want to point out that we often defer to: cure violence, previously known as ceasefire; focus deterrence; and the gang detachment, which came out of Irving Spergel back in the 1990s at U Chicago. And those are predominantly the three models that we look at because there's a lot of research that's been done around that. But I would also be the first to tell you, right, that those models are from 20 years ago. We're not evolving as quickly as we should. That's one thing. The second thing that I want to point out is that while I respect all folks who are, at least with good intent, are trying to elevate this work of CVI. And we do need an interdisciplinary approach to this work. I have to, as a social worker by training, I have to say that folks with a psychology background, community psychology, social workers who understand trauma are not often at the table leading the discussions. So what happens is that trauma gets overlooked. And so that's really critical, which is why, Nancy, in my earlier opening remarks, is why I'm so glad and delighted that you are here, because you have acknowledged some of those things and trying to get us to think about this, how we're going to be funding, what should we be funding, the questions that even Philip had brought up earlier, how do we explore that? So that's really critical. And the last thing that I'll just say is that, when we think about law enforcement and their role, and we think about outreach, this is the way to complement public safety. The problem is that too often we operate in our own silos. And there's a need here, and there's some good examples across this country where you see some good efforts taking place of how they're bringing their very best to the table. I also say that because when we talk about trauma, as all the accomplishment I've had being in this position, I still struggle with mine. And that's with all the supports that I've had, in the last 15 plus years of my life. And so I think about, what about the other people that we glamorize, we celebrate people with resiliency. We celebrate people who have been formerly incarcerated, who've been formerly in gangs, but we don't truly acknowledge what it takes for that person, right, to constantly retell their story, to constantly, in other words, when I say tell the story, it's almost, imagine if any of us on this call are constantly being introduced by the worst mistake they've done in their lives, or they're constantly being asked, tell us what brought you to this work, right? And so there's a need to acknowledge that, and we don't always acknowledge it because we don't see the worth of this population, because most of them are Black and brown, working inner cities. It goes back to what Shani pointed out. This is like a civil service rather you're doing. It's a in kind, which I'm really glad that at the Department of Justice, we have acknowledged that. And so for our current grantees, for example, that just recently been awarded, we encourage them to pay their staff equitably, because this is hazard work. And we need to acknowledge that, and I'm glad that the Department of Justice has done so, and we look forward to continuing to do more of that work. And that's also with your efforts, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Eddie. I think we could talk about trauma and how to measure it for the rest of our time here, but there's a few other areas that I was hoping we could touch upon. And one is on this idea of community engagement in the research process and how the community can drive the work. And when we had a pre-conversation on this, Henrika, you had a great example to share about how you thought you were engaging the community, and then you found out like, oh, there's even more we can do, and what the benefits of that are. I was hoping you could share that with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the NIJ project that I had funded a few years ago, Understanding the Violent Victimization Experiences of Young Black Men, which we gave a public name of Survive, because we wanted that to have a recognition of a positive experience. And for that project, I was the PI, but the rest of my kind of lead team were all white. My co-investigator was a white male. My project coordinator and director were both white females. And I was very thrilled to have a team that understood and agreed that we should not be doing the work, right? That this was driven by my understanding and experiences of being Black and living in Chicago in a neighborhood, but I am not a Black male and should not in any way, and neither would they, think that we should be in charge in terms of understanding what to do and how to proceed. And so we were very intentional about, having all Black males in our team be the trainers, the leaders, the interviewers, the recruiters, the focus group, going, and we hired people in their own communities to do their own work, allowed them to kind of guide everything, and we were all set. And we, when the launch of the project came about, it was on the front page of the Chicago Defender, which for me was a delight. I grew up, my father walked to the corner newsstand every morning to get the Chicago Defender. And so for me, that was just the highlight probably of my career. And within an hour of that article coming out, we were getting phone calls, and some of them were for women who wanted to be involved in the study. And I was ashamed to say I hadn't thought about that. We thought we were doing such good work by making sure that the population who was needing to be represented, whose voice we wanted heard, were Black men, were leading and engaged, but forgot, of course, Black women have something to say. And so we were fortunate in that we were able to get a rebudget done and able to include some key informant groups with Black women. And, so we wanted Black women who were sisters, mothers, grandmothers, significant others, wives, partners of men who were Black, 18 to 24, who had experienced, along with their Black male in their life, their experience with violence and what their perspective was. And so we realized the importance of understanding community is even bigger than it is when you think you know what community is, even when you're a part of the community, right? And so it was such valuable information for us for research, but I think even more valuable for those women, just like it was for the Black men. The Black men in our study found relationships that they didn't have. So many of them wanted to continue. We weren't allowed from IRB, but they wanted a Facebook group together. They exchanged phone numbers. They created relationships. But those Black women did the same thing. Even after those 2 hours, they exchanged numbers and information because they had a place that they were free to talk about their experience with community violence. and the experience they had with the Black men in their lives with community violence. So, the lesson learned for me, and I think for our team, and hopefully, for everyone else as we kind of disseminate that information, is when you think you have your community, set, assume you're wrong, and to make sure you ask the community what else you should be doing and who else should be engaged in the research, so that your perspective about community is actually accurate, so that you can really do the work that you think that you're doing and be effective.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a wonderful illustration of, how we have to approach this work with, a lot of humility. We know what we think we know, we do our best to learn, but we have to always be open to expanding the aperture, right? And learning more by really thinking through all the people who are affected. It gets back to the slide deck where I was talking about all the W questions, the who, what, where, why, how, when. If you answer all those questions, you get a really comprehensive view of everyone who's affected. But community, that's a tough word, right? Because it means different things to different people. And, I often find myself saying, the community is not a monolith. We're talking about how the community thinks, the community feels. And, I wonder, in the context of CVI interventions and measurement, where does law enforcement fit into the community? Where do healthcare providers fit into the community? How are we thinking about them when we're thinking about engagement? And I know that's somewhat controversial, but also a real pain point with some of these CVI efforts. Often law enforcement is viewed as part of the problem. Maybe they're not sharing data readily. Maybe they have a very traditional approach that runs counter to how the community thinks the violence intervention strategy should unfold. I'm just wondering if any of you have thoughts or experiences on that based on your role as research partners on CVI.
If I could jump in, I think this is a great question. Right? This is a panel discussion in and of itself. We collect lots of policing data, particularly from the perspective of the street survey and qualitative data, over the projects. We have particularly my work based in Wilmington, Delaware. We have a good working relationship with police. We've conducted cultural or racial sensitivity trainings with the police. We've had one captain and one lieutenant come in and, during one of our methods training, they were scheduled to lead a session. We always, before we hit the ground, because we're going to where the drugs is at, where the crack and where the heroin is at, to collect data, right? We always make sure to alert police officers we may be in the neighborhoods and communities, right? And we've never had a negative incident, right? But I'm also on the governor's police task force, and that task force, we've had some contentious conversations with some of the chiefs of police. I think with all that said, there is an adversarial relationship, definitely between poor Black and brown neighborhoods and mostly white male police departments, right? That is true in Wilmington, that is true in a number of communities across the country. I know for us, it is very problematic for members of the street or that community in Wilmington, right? They're always monitoring our relationship with the police, as they should, right? GVI, and there may be a number of folk that are fans of GVI, they're in our city, right? Keep in mind, GVI is responsible for 3 major indictments. They work closely with police as a model. We don't, Street Part, we don't. We don't share our data, we make that very clear, right? We clear lines, right? Right, GVI works closely with the police, right? And they're responsible for, meaning GVI, assisting with, Chief of Police said at a press conference, 3 major indictments in Wilmington, Delaware. Right, and the Chief of Police at the press conference said GVI is responsible, right? So I'm not making any of that up, right? We cannot have that kind of relationship with police. We cannot be responsible for locking your way up, locking up the neighborhood as a way to help, at least from our perspective, is not a form of help, right? The best way to reduce the violence is opportunity. We don't know anything else that works at that level right? And that's why I've had the ACLU, I've had the hospital system, I had major institutions in Delaware come to me, say, how can I help? Cool, we need them to have a real salary with real benefits, with a real office next to the white professionals, all sharing the same secretary. And a number have done that for my guys that are well-trained. University of Delaware hired one of my teams, all of them on one R1 project, paid everybody $17 an hour, right? And that would play much more of a role with regard to reducing arrest and convictions and a contentious relationship. This last point, I also think I'm not necessarily against police, right? But I do think it's important to underscore that communities would rather police themselves, right? So in Wilmington, right, 71% of the police force are white men. It's a predominantly Black city, right? It's the biggest city also in Delaware, right? As I said in one of my meetings on the Governor's Police Task Force, there is no white community in the country that is mostly policed by mostly Black men. And that's including the liberal ones too, right? They wouldn't even tolerate anything like that, right? And it's these kind of frank and very honest conversations. What is the purpose of the police, right? We all know, right, slave patrol, but the purpose, right, is to control, manage, punish, right? And obviously the wealthier, whiter community are not policed in the same ways, right? So we got to have this kind of honest, fresh conversation so that the relationship can improve and be what that we all want it to be, including those guys in the street.
Okay, thank you for that. So I don't want to let go of this policing conversation because they are also a source of data, right? That could be helpful. So I'm wondering if Shawnee, you wanted to share.
Yeah, it's hard to follow, Yasser, there.
Yeah.
But what I will say is from my research, I think a couple of things. One, the existence of like CVI organizations have to navigate police. They are going to show up in the same spaces. I mean, as Yasser just talked about with his streetcar work, like they're going to be in the same spaces. They're going to be focused on a lot of the same people. And so they physically have to navigate the relationships. There also has to be the recognition of the power differential that CVI organizations face when it comes to police. Police will always have the upper hand in terms of power, resources, the ability to apprehend, to extract, to take lives. And so how so that navigation of law enforcement, local law enforcement is really important for CVI organizations to figure out. And what the experts that I talked to identified are individuals within the police departments, whether they would be homicide detectives or leaders in the community policing divisions, to build the relationships with, because to your point, the data can be a really important source of guiding the efforts of CVI organizations. So how can you get those data? But I think it's really important to recognize that that power differential is there and it's real. And so where mayors or city leaders come into play in order to facilitate access to those data sources, to facilitate like recognizing these relationships, they have to be figured out if the CVI organizations are going to be able to survive and thrive. And so where city government leaders play a role in insisting that CVI be a part of the public safety strategy, the community safety strategy of a community, and insisting that police recognize and you know that there's identification of communication points. I think Yasser absolutely lifted up the fact that it's very important for CVI organizations to have that clear demarcation from police, that there's not information flowing back and forth, because that literally puts people's lives in danger. If there is any semblance of cooperation from the organizations, the frontline workers. But that doesn't mean that the leaders of the organizations, the higher up management, can have a relationship to say, we're going to be in this neighborhood, or, you know, if the ideally law enforcement is seeing the CVI organizations as viable partners in public safety. And if we're all aiming towards saving lives, then there's communication from police to say, there's something brewing over here. You know, you all can take the first step at helping to tamp it down. And there are examples in Los Angeles, there are examples out of New York, where because of the relationships with individuals within the police department and CVI organization leaders, CVI frontline, you know, the frontline violence interventionists were able to go in and give examples in Chicago as well. I'm looking at Eddie, of, you know, potential wars happening, potential, you know, real explosions of violence occurring without the CVI organizations being able to go in first before the police showed up, and to be able to go in and use the relationships they have, the you know, skills that they have to mediate conflict and tamp down the frustrations in ways that kept people from being arrested and kept people from losing their lives. And so I think, you know, to specifically to the point that you made about where law enforcement may play a role and police may play a role in the research, I think, you know, researchers can help to illuminate these nuances and contextual factors that help us figure out how best for CVI organizations to exist alongside police, because police are going to be there for the foreseeable, you know, for the foreseeable future. Police are going to be there, and they have, you know, incredible resources and discretion and freedom to move in the community. So how can we identify who those appropriate individuals are within police to help navigate that coexistence?
Thank you for that. Eddie, you've been patiently waiting to chime in.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Yasser and Shawnee just pointed out. You know, I recognize that I had tremendous privilege in my previous work at British Chicago. I was there for 5 years. Prior to that, I was at the YMCA doing a lot of work with juveniles, with young people who were on probation. And so the thing that I want to point out here is this. I could tell you that out of the 200 and almost 2,500 participants that were part of the study of the RCT, and this is kind of comparing apples to apples, I could tell you right now that on average, they had 17 to 18 arrests. I could tell you that 4 or 5 of them were felony arrests. I could tell you that 80%, although I think this number is higher because this is based on police data, but were victimized, meaning they were either shot, stabbed, or assaulted. Now, we believe that number is actually higher because not everybody goes to the hospital when that happens. I could also tell you that we know that our participants had about 80% of them had about 10th grade level of education, but they're reading at a 5th and 6th grade level. Now, I could go on. I could tell you that, you know, now this one is self-reported. I could tell you that about 60% of them were actually fathers. I could tell you that about close to 80% of them were struggling with housing, right? But the other points that I mentioned early on, the only reason why I know that is because we had a partnership with the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, to which they had a partnership with the police department. And then we had partnerships with the juvenile probation, juvenile corrections. And then we had a partnership with the sheriff office, the county jail, and the Department of Corrections of Illinois. So those data points, as we started off this conversation, were very critical for me to think about, where do I exert my resources? I have about $18 to $20 million. That was my budget. I'm funding 6 different organizations on the ground. So I'm helping to build their capacity and ensuring that they're engaging the right audience, who I would say are high-risk individuals. And so I think that there's definitely ways that we could partner with law enforcement. And there's definitely so many ways that we need to also partner with learning institutions, research institutions, right? That could help us think about this data to help inform decisions and strategies. So I just wanted to lift that up, because I recognize that sometimes, you know, we were expecting people on the ground to build these relationships. they're critical in building relationships in the community as they should. But that's why, to Shani's point, leadership in these organizations need to also build their relationships with law enforcement and vice versa. This is a two-way street. You know, we have low clearance rates right now in many cities. You know, part of it is because of the lack of trust with law enforcement and community. So how do we build? And that goes back to what Yasser pointed out. This is my last comment around this, is the need to heal. We need to be very intentional to create spaces, right? To be able to come together, whether it's a peace circle or restorative justice process, whatever that looks like, but to be able to find ways to heal so that we could use a space to talk about our perspective of the work and the way that we're thinking about what brought us to this work.
Thank you, Eddie. Very well put. There are two more categories of topics I was hoping we could discuss today. One is around measurement and measuring not just success from failure and how we can learn from failures. And that includes measuring early on so we really know kind of how to plan and develop programs that are effective and that have the runway to develop robustly, right? I worry about CVI running so fast, right? Because everyone's excited about this new initiative and this new influx of federal resources and resources from philanthropy and everybody looking for the impact. They want to see that it works yesterday. So like, how are we as researchers and what can we share with the research community around how we think about measurement and maybe manage expectations around what we can expect to see after 6 months and 12 months and maybe even 18 months. And what about if we end up measuring failure and what can we learn from that? So I'm thinking of Shani and Philip first. Shani, because in that LISP report, and by the way, we put a link to it in the chat so everyone can check it out. It's amazing. I read it this morning. You did make a point about how the program developers need a longer runway, right? You need more time to get up and running. And then Philip, a lot of your research has highlighted what we can learn from failure and what we can learn from applying a model in a new jurisdiction, right? That makes note of what works and what doesn't so that we don't replicate the same errors, but we learn from them and create better programs. So I'll turn it over to Shani and then Philip and then anyone else who wants to chime in on that topic. And then we're going to move to the last topic. So just in the back of your head, think about communicating research findings.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think from the experts that I talked to for the report and experts that I've talked to beyond the report, it's been said already how important relationships are. And I think it's important to recognize that even though for CVI organizations, they may be hiring individuals who have relationships in the community, what they are being asked to do now in this professional role is different. And so while they may know individuals and have relationships in the community, and that makes them, potential good, strong hires for the roles that they will now be conducting, it's important for the relationships to be built across individuals on the team, for the relationships to be built within the organizations. Thinking about what does a group of peers now, with there's some hierarchy in the relationship, how do they come together and interact? And then what is the relationship like with the organization and the community? So building those relationships and establishing what these relationships look like, identifying the population that you're intending to engage, all those things take time. And that's just to get started. And then when you're talking about what does impact of the intervention look like, Henrique talked about the multiple forms of violence. It's been brought up, structural violence in so many different ways, concentrated in these communities where community violence is also high. And so what does impact look like over time? And how do you, how can you possibly address all of the harms of all of these systems within a year or 2 or 3 or 5. That does not mean that these programs, these interventions cannot have impact, but it's important to think about, what are we measuring when we're thinking about, if we're talking about underemployment, under-resourced, lack of economic opportunity, high rates of criminal legal contact, and formerly incarcerated individuals who struggle to gain legal, lawful employment across multiple sectors, lack of housing, lack of food security, all of these things. But you're putting all of the weight on a CVI organization to fix all of that. Yasser said it best, like ample opportunity is by far the way that we best address violence. So violence intervention, community violence intervention, is a harm reduction model. It is an approach to address at the individual level, to try to reduce the harms at the individual level that the systems have caused at the community level. And so that longer runway is just really important, as well as researchers partnering with the organizations to understand, what does progress look like to you? When I talk to, there is an individual, James Timpson, phenomenal individual out of Baltimore, who currently is leading training for ROCA, the program ROCA in Baltimore. And JT talks about, progress can look like, if an individual didn't get out of bed 4 out of 5 days last week, and they show up 5 out of 5 days this week, that's progress. That is a gain. That is something to celebrate. And yet I don't know any research evaluation of a CVI intervention that counts that as success. And so researchers absolutely need to partner with organizations to identify what these measures of success look like over time. What can you expect to see in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years? And then researchers have the obligation to help manage expectations across all boards, whether it be the funders, city leaders, programs, what can we see? And again, that does not mean that we cannot see reductions in violence, because that can happen. But there's so much more that these interventions bring, and so much more that we should be measuring as it relates to success, that continues to be left out of the most evaluations, although I know a number of researchers are identifying these and incorporating more of this into their work. But as it relates to that longer runway, both for building up and implementing the intervention, as well as what it looks like to fund the intervention over time, and to provide stable funding and stable support to the workforce and the participants being served by the workforce, in a way that allows for some innovation, some creativity, some thinking beyond the traditional standard ways. And trial and error, exactly. Allowing for some failure, allowing for us to tweak. We have the ability in so many other ways to innovate and see what happens and tweak. And evaluation should play an important role in that. And everybody wants to save lives. So this is not about playing with people's lives and not taking violence reduction seriously. It's about really expanding beyond the 3 models that Eddie mentioned that were developed 30 years ago, and thinking about, what does, truly community guided efforts to reduce violence look like? What does that healing, that resilience, that thriving look like? How do we build that into these models and allow to test and see what happens if we actually fund it appropriately, rather than just having an idea and hoping somebody goes out on a shoestring budget and does their best.
Right. So well put. Thank you, Shawnee. And it really underscores the importance and power of that logic model that I was describing earlier, because you described a lot of discrete intermediate outcomes that are very upstream from the ultimate goal of reducing violence. And all of those matter. And I think that, if we can support programs that build in that type of measurement, we have something to show, right? It's okay, this is a journey, y'all. This is not going to be easy, because these are very complex issues, right? That go well beyond just the players that we bring together for CVI, right? There's so much, so much. So like, what can we do to show that we're addressing all of those logical intermediate outcomes that we believe, and I think the evidence supports, are all related to the end goal of prevention. So we're talking about trial and error and failure, and so I wanted to kick it to Philip to talk about his experiences on that front.
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I look at the time, it's 2:39. I think you have another area, and I think there are lots of questions to be asked. And I'll try not to repeat anything that's been said. And Nancy, you shared part of my answer to this larger question around the importance of having folks understand what the value of a logic model. But part of our problem in this space is that, very rarely do you find null or negative findings ever get published. And that's a piece of the industry we have to change. And I think, journals won't accept things with null findings because they don't see the value of it. I think that is one of probably the biggest missed opportunities to share those failures in a way that's useful to folks. And part of that is being able to document what has occurred. And that's why, in terms of thinking about this work, implementation is so critical. Well, the documentation of implementation is so critical to this work moving forward. I also think it's unfair to put all this pressure on CVI. The work that's been done in Milwaukee, there's a 6-point strategy, and that's one called Just Stop the Violence. One's called Promoting Health, Healing and Restorative Justice. One is Supporting Children, Youth, and Families, Promoting Economic Opportunities, Fostering Safe Neighborhoods, and then Building and Strengthening Capacity. The reason there's 6 is that this problem is complex, and putting the onus on a single intervention to change these things is unfair. So part of our job as researchers is to educate decision makers about the importance of looking at intermediate outcomes. And that's first starting with outputs. Something has to be done and done differently, and demonstrating that was done is step one, right? Because if you aren't doing anything, nothing's going to change, or at least nothing you can attribute to that intervention. And the second is really having folks understand the importance of these intermediate outcomes, as you just said. Politicians and decision makers want to see crime go down and all these other things. And that will happen, and that is important. But we have to show them that if you do A, B will happen, and understanding the sequence of things shows that we are moving in the right direction. And so for me, that is critically important. But and the last thing I'll put in this importance of looking at collecting retrospective data, and I'm going to use Milwaukee as an example. It's the blueprint that was developed using the Prevention Institute's ACER model, really involved community in a way I've never seen before, really involved in its development. Once it came to implementation, though, what we quickly learned is a lot of that work, and done well, happened through the Office of Violence Prevention. But residents weren't as involved as one might think they would be. We didn't learn that and understand that until we did the retrospective, ask how things started, and got to a point and moved forward. And so for me, having that data to understand context allows us to do the work better. And that's how the community organizing piece got added, because recognizing that it was could be a catalyst for also engaging residents in this work in partnership with the Office of Violence Prevention. And so if you're not asking the right questions, then you can often miss why things are working when they aren't. And so I'll stop there and saying that, we have to really think broadly about data collection, and this notion of what is a measure of success. Working with Native tribes said that, Western society has its definition of what success is. And you never ask us what we consider success. And that example that Shani was perfect, right? And I think it was Shani. The fact that you got up and went to work 5 days in a row, that is a measure of success that we just don't think about, right? And so redefining what success is and showing people that is a way that, and it segues into talking about communication. Politicians love a story, right? How do we talk about empirical storytelling? And I don't want to jump the gun, but that's the other piece about really reinterrogating how data is used and how data is discussed to really kind of make the case for the work we're doing, so that folks give us time to really talk about long-term success. So I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So here's where we are. We've got about, I don't know, 12 more minutes. We promised we'd do Q&A from the audience. Thing is, I've been tracking, they've been coming in. I've been integrating some of those questions into some of my follow-ups to you all along. Also, some of the questions are very specific to individuals. So what we want to do, audience, is to share those offline with individual panelists and invite them to respond. Some of the questions are about, can you tell me more about this? Or how did you do that? Or, you know, can you give me a link to these resources? So rest assured, attendees, we will address all of those questions. But I don't want to give short shrift to the part of the conversation around communications, communicating findings. How do we do that effectively? Who should be speaking on behalf of the program? How should that be communicated? Should there be different communication strategies for different audiences? What works best? What doesn't work well at all? What are your experiences in that? I'd just love to hear from anybody.
I'll chime
I say
in.
yes. No, go ahead, Henry.
Yes.
I just, you go for it.
Mine is brief. I was just going to say, I think it's important to take the show on the road. We started a mini tour of presenting kind of in one of our central locations and having our panelists who worked on our project present what they wanted to present. So they decided what they wanted to present, how they wanted to present, what the format was. My college and me, we were the support. And the goal was, let's take it on the road. So, you know, the idea was all the places that we collected data, because we were in Alabama and Delaware, et cetera, that our goal was we wanted to go to all those communities and have our panelists, who are the people that were our team, get paid to go and do that, you know, pay for their time so that they could share their experiences, what they learned, what they wanted to know, the things that often in our meetings, they were shocked sometimes at what they heard. They felt like, I'm a Black man, I won't hear anything surprising. But when they got together as a team, they found that they were surprised too, and they wanted to share that. So my brief answer is, you share the findings by taking it on the road to exactly the places that you thought were so important to collect the data from. They're more important to give the data back to, so you can find out, share with them and find out what you missed, and then let them drive what the next thing should be. So.
Thank you.
You know, for me, it's moving beyond, I'm not an academic, so I can say this, moving beyond the academic model of dissemination, right? I tell my team, a journal article is really important, particularly your career development. But if that's the only thing you want to do, I'm not the person to work with, right? And so this is about translation and really making translation a part of the delivery of findings. And it's multi-pronged, right? And I think one, we have to get NIJ, NIH, philanthropy to understand that there have to be multiple avenues and paths to the dissemination of information. And that is well beyond the journal article that only we read, right? And then that's also done in partnership with the people we're working with. One of the things we've been working on is like what's called story mapping. And so it's a visual depiction of the findings from something that's written in a report that's way too long for anyone to comprehend. Then breaking things down into smaller parts, infographics, webinars. And so you think about every different platform in which you can share information and figure out how you pull key nuggets to maximize the issue about how we build the field and how we increase awareness. And I think, you know, in anything that's been written to a funder now, having a culturally competent and responsive dissemination translation strategy has to be built in from the beginning. And that means you have to think about where that needs to happen. Some of the most incredible storytellers are folks who never step foot on a college campus. So I've been working on, what does empirical storytelling look like? It's not anecdotal. It's really amalgamation of everything that's happened in a way that makes the case. And that's how you move people. For better or worse, unfortunately, politicians don't look at findings. They love a story. Well, how can we make our stories empirical, that you get the benefit of not misinformation or disinformation, but a story based on data and evidence? And so I think those are some of the things that I'm looking forward to really pushing more and figuring out the different ways to measure things. And there are a host of avenues of sharing and translating information that we have to do a better job of taking advantage of.
I may add just real quickly, I think communication strategies need to happen in a comprehensive way. We've made well over 200 talks since 2010. We've grown considerably. We're probably about 150 or beyond, 120 guys and women who are either street PAR associates or honorary associates, and a bevy of students, faculty, and institutional partners. And we are growing, right? PAR is a really big deal in Delaware for what it's worth. But I think the best way to think about that strategy is first with, right, the team. They'll let you know, community let you know everything you need to know, right? Who to go to, right? It doesn't mean that we don't inform or add in, right? But we think about our communication and or our presentations, at least on a couple of different levels. Definitely keep in mind, street PAR is a socio-political project, right? It's about achieving power, right? So that's why we train them. We train the former gang member to run regressions, right? And publish in the journals, right? Because it's about power, but we're also writing op-eds, right? So written communication, right? Book chapters. One of my guys last night said to the team in a team meeting, we got finished working on a handbook chapter, about 50 pages. He really loved that experience. And he's now, right, imploring, asking the rest of the team, we gotta, it's a new team in Philly. You guys gotta do this, right? And they're going to do that as well. In addition to that, we present to the larger community or outside of the street community. We also target the streets. We present in the projects, so to speak, or in the local parks, right? We need those guys to hear us and read us as well, right? We also take the guys on the road, right? And we speak to civic and political leadership, city council, county council, mayor's office, governor's office, et cetera, right? So in academic spaces and political spaces, we also engage in the arts. We do film, we got 2 documentaries in, we put out 2 mixtapes, we do musical showcases, and the streets told us to do this around gun violence and inequality. And these programs are well attended. Sometimes hundreds, if not thousands, come out in Delaware, right? In addition to that,
such a small state for that kind of turnout.
Yes. So just also really quickly, my guys, in addition to doing op-eds, co-authoring, primary authoring, very important that they're doing that in the journals, book chapters, right? But they're also putting out they're self-publishing their own book projects, fictional sometimes, right? And as a way to showcase what's going on. Okay.
That's amazing. There's a private chat going on among panelists where we all want to mixtape. So we'll be sending you our addresses, Yasser. But to your point, just to summarize what you're saying, part of communication of data and findings is really to know who owns that, who owns those findings. And I would say, we have to do all we can to democratize that, bring those findings back to the community, the people who helped generate it, the people who we interviewed, the people who we partnered with, the people who were the outreach workers, et cetera. They should be the owners of the data, and all the different mechanisms that you described to help translate those findings in different ways that can be more accessible to them, it is empowering. And I think it really can help transform communities. So thank you so much for that. Eddie, I'm gonna give you the last word since this is your bigger show.
Nancy, this is, the power of storytelling. There's so much that I could say to this, but there's a couple of things that I want to make sure our audience really understands, right? There's one thing that we're trying to empower people and create, a voice, rightfully so for them. But the other thing is that we have to be careful not to tokenize. It's a slippery slope there in terms of, how participants, how people who are doing the research on the ground, like how they might interpret that. And at the end of the day, what that really means is what we've been talking about here, the power of relationships. I think about, thinking about the movie Just Mercy, trying to blank on the name right now, but
Brian Stevenson.
Brian Stevenson, when he talks about building proximity, right? It's one thing that our communities hear and feel empowered about their voice, and that's really has to continue to be the center of what we're doing. But it's also really important for us that other folks who have never walked a day in their lives, either in our communities or in the shoes of many of the folks that we're working with, we have to be intentional how to build with them as well. How do we build community with them? This is in observations. I visit different cities and speaking more about Chicago. in large part, the reason why people are so interested in CVI is because for the first time, you have a glass, right, that's been full. And now that violence, right, that typically existed in certain communities is now spilling over. And so as a result of that, you have people who have never been in these conversations really engage in these conversations. So I think of it as an opportunity to engage them, to build that proximity, and how do we continue our advocacy? How do we continue to bring people along so that people could see the humanity of the work that we're doing? So just sharing that in terms of like even these webinars, that's the intent of it in many ways. I said that in my first objective, the objectives of these webinars that we created. Every single webinar is about building community. Nancy, you did an amazing job with our panelists here to be able to build that community here. People who have been doing the work on the ground from different disciplines. So I want to just simply highlight that. And the last thing that I'll just say for our audience, I was at the White House just a week ago where we're speaking. We were asked, Amy Solomon, who's the head of OJP, and I spoke to an audience of about 150 people there, and they were sunsetting, they were wrapping up this whole hyphen initiative that we were thinking that the White House was pushing forward. Amazing group, amazing findings there, right, as we're pushing forward. The truth is, when I heard Yasser mention this, like, we need a seat at the table. We have a seat at the table. And in fact, in the Department of Justice, and I would say with our current administration, we have our own table. So for our listeners right now, we are telling you, you have a table, and so it's really important that we continue this pathway of engagement. So anyways, I'll pass it back on to you, Nancy.
Well, I gave you the last word for a reason, because I can't top that, other than to thank the panelists. You all are amazing. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to learn from you today, and also to thank all the people behind the scenes who have made this webinar possible. There's a whole team of folks who have been working this, and I want to thank all of them. And thanks for joining, audience.
Well, Nancy, on that note, I'm going to just wrap us up here by simply saying thank you for being here, for participating. Nancy, panelists, thank you so much for your comments, for your contributions here. I would highly encourage, please visit our next webinar. We'll be really focusing on sustaining the CVI ecosystem. So this is about funding at the federal level, and then with philanthropy. What are we learning? What are we seeing? And so please tune in, as this will be an opportunity to continue to elevate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Nancy, thank you again.